Awesome. I think Zoom has turned us all into like elementary school teachers. Oh goodness. But like I said, it's great to visit with you guys this evening. And this is the second presentation that I've done with BlkArthouse. So if you attended that first presentation, you may hear me kind of going over a few of the same themes. I have a very particular way that I think about the art market, the ecosystem, and a very particular way that I represent clients. So you'll hear me say the words intellectual property, structure, strategy. You'll hear me say those words a lot. And it's kind of like the same perspective that I brought to my presentation, which was in June sometime. And I don't know if that's been uploaded online yet, but this is kind of a continuation. That first presentation, we deep dived in terms of artist rights. And the goal of this presentation is to talk about the arts ecosystem and really get into the weeds of kind of how I work with artists to protect the work that they do. And it has to do with understanding the ecosystem in general. So this is more about me. I'm managing attorney of my own firm. I work almost exclusively with artists, creatives, more broadly speaking, designers, makers, anyone that's sort of monetizing their creativity, but mostly visual artists. And I help them start up businesses, protect the fruits of their creativity, and also grow sustainable businesses. So if you're familiar with areas of law, these are some of the areas of law and the industries that I focus my attention towards, which is art and entertainment, fashion, beauty, represent brands and influencers. I do a lot of dispute resolution. I don't do as much litigation as I used to, but I have that experience, and I have offices based in Dallas, Texas, which is where I am now. And I established my virtual presence in Philadelphia, which is where I went to law school. So I'm licensed in Pennsylvania and Texas. So a little bit more about me for those who I haven't met yet or who weren't a part of the first presentation. I'm an attorney, obviously. I'm also an art lover. I'm a collector. I'm an artist advocate. Born and raised in Houston, went to school in Austin, kind of did that circle thing that people do where they leave, maybe their state where they're born and they kind of live other places. And like I said, I'm currently in Dallas. So I kind of made that complete loop, if you're familiar with the geography of the United States, from Texas to the West Coast to the East Coast and back to the third coast, which is where I am now, physically located. So in terms of my background, I've always straddled the world of business and art. So my formalized undergraduate education was within the McCombs School of Business at UT Austin. So I was a business major, marketing major. And at the same time, I was majoring in art history in the College of Fine Arts. And so for me, I've always seen the connections between the business world and what's happening there, and then the world of art in general. And so pursued education to kind of send me in that direction. And then ultimately, I ended up going to law school specifically to practice art law, which at the time wasn't as prevalent or well known as a distinct area of practice as it is now. Also, art law as a discipline has increased, but way back when, over a decade ago, when I originally went to law school, that's exactly what I wanted to do. So I have corporate experience. I was in sales and marketing, did that before I went to law school. I clerked for a judge right after I graduated. That kind of assisted me very well in my experience as a litigator because I was sort of in court with my judge pretty much every day. Most of my practice now is transactional. What that means is I do more like paper-based. I provide more paper-based legal services. That's contract negotiation, setting up companies, things like that, versus being in court. So that's the distinction between a litigator and a transactional attorney. And like I said, I have my own firm, which has been such a blessing and very exciting for me to be able to focus my services and what I'm interested in the specific group of people that I service now. So in terms of topics of discussion, I just did the intro and gave you some background, but we're talking about the arts ecosystem and how to navigate it in general. And so I tend to start with orienting my clients in sort of like the macro view versus the micro view. So we'll start there. I want to talk to you about the creative economy. And in case you're wondering why that doesn't say art market, I will explain to you what the creative economy means and why we're starting that macro before we deep dive into the ecosystem. Then we'll get into the ecosystem we'll talk about some navigation tools. These are just some tool sets, some things that I use to work with clients, different mindsets, different things to think about as you're trying to navigate the ecosystem. And then I have 3 case studies for you. I have broken down 10 steps, 10 things that I walk through with current clients to help them navigate the ecosystem. And I have sort of walked through those steps to make a contrast between where we were when I first started working with them and kind of where we are now. So all of that is more than the hour time that we have. So I'm going to breeze through. Again, this is recorded, but also feel free to take screenshots of the slides. And of course, if you have any questions, you can contact me directly after the presentation. I will say now that nothing that I'm saying is legal advice. You'll see the disclaimer at the end. So I'm not providing legal advice. So nothing I say is for your specific situation. It's more information to give you a framework from which to view what you're doing. So to me, the most important place to start, and this is a place that I kind of start with all of my clients, is getting a grasp on the difference between looking at things from a macro viewpoint to a micro viewpoint. So macro, visually, it's like the vertical viewpoint. It's like the drone view. You know, we used to say 30,000 foot view. If you're old enough to remember that reference, now we say the drone view. But it's taking a look, like raising your viewpoint up above kind of like where you are as an artist. So if you're an artist, you're mostly focused on what's in front of you, maybe what's like your studio, maybe, you know, the scope of like what you look at a daily basis, on a daily basis. But it's very important to get an understanding of what's happening at the macro level. So that's kind of like the drone view, like drill out, you know, from where you are and take a look at what's happening in the art market around you. The opposite of that would be the micro view. So that's more the horizontal view for those who are visually, who understand things visually, a visual learner. I call it the footprint view. This is like your day-to-day. This is your, like the decisions you make on a day-to-day basis. This is how you're viewing what you're doing as an artist or art market, art ecosystem participant on a day-to-day basis. So at any given point in time, what I found is that the artists who meet their goals, collectors who meet their goals, the folks who are participating in the ecosystem that meet whatever goal they have, whatever that is, they're constantly shifting between what's going on kind of up here and then what's going on like down here. So they're constantly keeping tabs on what's happening at the macro level and what's happening at the micro level. So we'll revisit this theme later on when it comes to the art trends. So another way to think about micro versus macro from the artist perspective, and most of the viewpoints, the way that I organized this presentation was from the artist perspective, because most of my clients are the actual artists. I do represent sort of pretty much a lot of different folks within the art ecosystem, which I'll kind of show you who those folks are, but most of my clients are artists. So the day-to-day kind of micro view, so we're flipping, we're looking at the micro view first, tends to be a little bit more short-term. It's about paying bills. It's hyper-local, focused on what's happening like in the neighborhood, what's happening in their city, really focused on their viewpoint is often like tunnel visioned into just what's happening in their studio, what's happening in their practice. And their concern on a daily basis is what's in the bank account. So I put an asterisk there because that's typically where artists kind of start, which is practical, right? Because you like have to pay bills, right? People, the first is coming, right? The first of the month is coming. So, and then the 15th is going to come after that, right? So these are practical things. But in terms of navigating the art ecosystem and being able to have the most flexibility and being able to get ahead of trends or be able to take advantage of some of the things that are going on, this hyper like micro view and just being focused on that tends to be the number one thing that is an impediment for artists reaching whatever goal that they have. That's typically where artists are focused. On the second part of the screen, right, you're seeing more of that macro view. It's more long-term. It's definitely focused on wealth creation. So you switch from what you do to pay bills versus what you do to, you know, create wealth that you can pass down. It's very much focused on wealth creation. You're leaving the hyper local and moving up to the international, like what's going on in the whole world. you're shifting from a focus on just what's happening in your studio and your practice to what's happening in the entire ecosystem. And it's in terms of just the economic structure, it's not just what's happening in your bank account, but it's what's happening in the creative economy. And here I purposely wanted to focus on the creative economy versus the art market. I'll explain to you why in a minute, but having a viewpoint of the creative economy is a way to orient yourself to take advantage of all the things that are going on. So what's the creative economy? You know, if you were to Google it, you'll find like a many different definitions. There are all sorts of books that talk about this. It's been referred to as the creative class, the creative ecology, creative industries, creative business, cultural industry, creative workforce. So depending on the discipline of the person talking about it, if they're like labor focused, they'll talk about the creative economy in terms of the workforce, like the labor market. If you have someone that's focused more on just economic models, and particularly historians who are trying to track what's happening to the way humans create value over time, they typically call it the creative economy. So there's many different books on this. Again, you could just Google creative economy books and you'll have like a list of like 10 books that come up that you can read about this if you have any time. But in terms of Viewpoint, it's looking at the creative economy in terms of what's happening internationally, what's happening nationally, what's happening at the state level, and what's happening at the local level. And what I mean by, when I say local, I mean your municipality. The main point that I want to kind of get over to you guys is that the creative economy is a thing that think tanks, governments, policy wonks, economists, legislators, people who are looking to increase their wealth, people who are looking for different ways to organize the human workforce, the labor market globally, they are all looking at the creative economy. So what I'm trying to impress upon you is what you're doing in your studio, what you're doing with your own artistic practice is important, not just for the art market, but it's important for how like actual governments are organizing and planning for how they are going to legislate and govern people. So you have the UN who's looking at this, you have, UNESCO, different folks like that. Indeed, 2021 is the year of the creative economy, in case you didn't know that. When you Google creative economy, you'll see that 2021 is the year of creativity. And that's just an organizing principle around this idea that individual people being able to monetize their creativity is an economic driver that's being measured. So this to me is very important for artists to understand. Again, it's not just about what you're producing in your studio, it's about this cultural shift in what's happening and how human beings create value and what is considered to be an actual economy. This is a hyper macro view. So who are involved in the creative economy? It's essentially people monetizing creativity to create economic value, whether it's on an individual basis or in organized groups. What are they doing? They're monetizing creativity as the resource itself. Creativity is a resource, and it's the main driver of value creation of an economic system. And this is contrasted with land and labor and capital and the types of things that a whole bunch of people have not had access to for a very long time. So the importance of this shift, even from a social justice standpoint, is something I can't impress enough. And I'm gonna have to move on because I really get on my soapbox about this because there's a social justice element to this. It's not just land, labor, and capital attached to those things. It's what's literally in between your ears. It's what's in your mind. The where, it's worldwide. People are looking at these trends worldwide. This is not a United States thing. This is not a North America thing. This is everywhere. Colonial, post-colonial, wherever you are in the world, these are economic systems that are being tracked by governments and tracked by think tanks and policy wonks and people who are looking at this, particularly people who are trying to extract value from it. It could be described as a 21st century phenomenon. That's just to orient it between the Industrial Revolution and what could be considered the Information Revolution and some of these other ways that we've organized human history. But it's supported by the internet and technological resources, computing power, increases in computing power, things like that. Why? There's, depending on who you ask and their viewpoint, you can ask an anthropologist, question why, they'll give you an answer. You can ask an economist why that this is a trend. They'll give you an answer. My answer is the internet. Simple as that. It's just technology, right? The ability to shift the worldview and the ability to connect with people through the internet. That's my answer for it. And how is this happening? How is the creative economy supported? Through education, a shift in the mindset of the artists themselves and their posture. Again, there's definitely a social justice element that is sort of baked into the idea of the creative economy. And I would say number one thing is the rejection of the starving artist ethos, right? This idea that the artist is tortured and starving and must do this to create the art. Many artists are shifting to, no, this can be sustainable. I can support myself and my family and create wealth through what I make. And so that's kind of like a overview of the creative economy. Just to drill down, it sounds like there are folks here on the call that are from other places, but just to drill down, two organizations, if you're more interested in these numbers and how it's being tracked, like from an economic standpoint, you want to check out Americans for the Arts. That's like a national advocacy group. And I just took a quote here off of their website. They're very much tying economic principles to the idea that art and culture is an economic driver. So there's a quote there where they're talking about cultural creativity being a driving force for empowerment, economic and social justice across the country. You have an organization called the National Assembly of State Art Agencies, and they aggregated some hard numbers that were obtained from a study on the economic impact of arts and culture. Again, you can go to Americans for the Arts, search creative economy and get access to these numbers. But if you go directly to the National Assembly of Art Agencies, there's like a sort of a summary of the main findings. But listen, art and cultural production was 4.3% of GDP. This is 2019 number. The point is that that's more than the construction and transportation sectors. So the economic sector of construction and transportation, those two sectors did not contribute as much to the national gross domestic product as art and cultural production. This is a massive thing to understand in terms of what is happening with the creative economy and how important it is to even the GDP of the United States of America. There are about 52 million art and cultural sector jobs in 2017. The new number should be coming out soon. And in terms of entrepreneurship, folks within arts and cultural production are 3.6 times more likely than the total US workforce to be self-employed. Some of you may hear that statistic and say, well, of course, because artists, they are self-employed by definition, but if you know how important, or if you've been kind of tracking the conversation around entrepreneurship and how important that is, small businesses, Main Street, all of these kind of like terms that are used in election cycles, you know that small businesses and entrepreneurship are kind of like the heart of the middle class. So it says something to me that it's artists and people within the cultural industries that are just more likely than the typical US workforce of being self-employed. So this is, again, I want to start here in terms of like the creative economy and what it means as, you know, you as an artist or someone that's participating in the art ecosystem, what that means for the economy of the United States as a whole, but then also what's happening on a global scale. Now, I will say that if you go to the Americans for the Arts, you'll be able to drill down at what's happening in your neck of the woods. You'll be able to see what's happening at your state level, because they aggregated this information from the state level and the local level. Often, if you have an art school or an art and business school, or an art school that focuses on business in your area, they will have their own reports. In Dallas, there's Southern Methodist University. They have an arts entrepreneurship. I want to say it's a major. If not, it's a minor, but either way, they have a think tank. They have resources that proactively go out and collect information about the impact of art to the local North Texas economy. And it's, you know, millions of dollars annually. So again, to me, it's very important to understand kind of where you are, and the awareness of what's happening in this shift in global economic systems is important. Again, not just what's happening in your studio, but what's happening like globally. And then my other point is, it's not just the art market. If you're focusing just on the art market, you may miss out on opportunities because your view is kind of focused on just what's happening in the market. There's opportunities outside of the art market that you can avail yourself of in terms of the art ecosystem. So let's turn our attention to the art ecosystem. And I call this the studio wall to collector wall sort of dichotomy. I was thinking of different ways to visually represent this. And essentially it's like a continuum. You have from your studio, like who are all the people and where are all the places that your art can be when it leaves your studio, all the way to when it gets to a collector wall, be it an individual collector like myself, or like an institution like a museum. There are a bunch of people involved in this ecosystem. So I just listed some. There's some organization in terms of like what I kind of listed first versus last in a particular list. But I put all this up on this slide so you can kind of get a visual representation of all the people that are involved in the ecosystem. So if we're taking an artist-centered view, just starting at the left of your screen, you have nonprofits, you have cultural institutions like foundations, you have for-profit businesses, you have what's happening at your municipality, you have business partners, you have brands. Those are all the types of folks who may be coming to you, that you as an artist may interact with as places or people who are commissioning art. As an artist, you have academia, you have mentors, you have partners, you have collaborators, you have other creatives that you work with, like photographers to help you, properly photograph your work, or other artists, right? So those are folks that you may work with. You have gallerists, curators, dealers, collectors. I make a distinction between a dealer and a gallerist because gallerists tend to have physical locations. Dealers don't necessarily have a physical location. They tend to purchase the art as the title holder, and then they sell the art on the secondary market. So there are some dealers that are not consigning artwork. They've purchased it. They own the title after they purchase it, and then they're reselling it. You have collectors in general. You have collector groups. These are groups of people who are pooling money together to build a collection. You have artist collectives, groups of artists pooling resources together. You have art consultants, agencies, PR folks, publicists, all of these folks. These are all sort of service providers, people within the art ecosystem that you may interact with. As an artist, you may avail yourself of residencies. There's different art prizes, generally speaking, different things that you can sort of apply for. Publications are things that you're probably thinking about, right? Getting into certain catalogs, getting into certain shows, having someone write, having a curator or someone like that write about your work from an academic standpoint. You're dealing with framers, you're dealing with art handlers. I could have put printers here as well for those who are printing, their work. A lot of social media support out there, studio assistants. I have, a couple clients that have studio assistants. You're interacting with public spaces, non-traditional art spaces, galleries, again, in terms of where your art can physically be located, the dealer inventory, storage facilities, right? Free ports. These are places where art's stored, auction houses, fairs, the collections themselves, and then your own inventory as an artist, which is one thing that artists tend to forget. Anything that you have is your own inventory, something that you haven't sold or that isn't in the hand of a dealer or a gallerist, it's your inventory, right? So that's another place where your art sits. You have the idea of the fine art world versus commercial art. I'll show you how that splits in terms of mindset and how you pursue opportunities in the art ecosystem. You have the local economy, small business owners, they're working with artists. And then you have multinational corporations, big brands who are reaching out to artists, offering opportunities. You have the digital space, virtual spaces, augmented spaces, and then I have off-chain versus off-chain, on-chain versus off-chain. That is code for blockchain. And of course, I'm talking about also NFTs, which everyone wants to talk about a lot. Sometimes, and not talk about anything else, but it's this idea that there are things happening on-chain, like through blockchain technologies like NFT, which are blockchain enables NFTs, non-fungible tokens. And then you have the things that are happening off-chain, which is like in real life. I would put an asterisk by service providers here at the bottom left of your screen. And these are in order by, I think, importance. Typically when I'm working with artists, first thing I ask them is if they have a CPA. Because if they don't have a CPA, there have been many times where I'll send a client to a CPA first, and I'll say, get the CPA to get your tax situation in order, and then come talk to me, because I can help you, but at the end of the day, the IRS can shut you down. So let's get a CPA first. Then insurance is typically the second thing that I will recommend, right? So get an insurance agent. Either you're insuring your own work, or you have, depending on what space you sit in, you may have insurance that you need for a studio because your work is in a physical location. There's insurance is very important, not just life insurance, but insurance for your own work, making sure you understand how your work is insured when it leaves your studio on the way to a collector. Insurance is always in the back of the mind. It's a risk mitigation tool, very important. Typically, you're interacting with real estate agents or landlords if you're renting a space. Then the attorneys come in, attorneys and counsel, and I'll use 3 different words to describe attorneys. You have lawyers, you have attorneys, and you have counsel. And the way you think about legal services and your mindset of what you're doing depends on who you contact or why you contact a person who's licensed to practice law. So you have attorneys, you have counsel, which there's a distinction there from a psychological standpoint, and then a banker, right? Because you want to be so successful that you have a banker. So these are the people in place, and you might need access to capital to do certain things. So developing a relationship with a banker is important. I'm sure there's probably a person on this slide. So there are a lot of people that are involved in the ecosystem, a lot of people that touch the life of an artist when they're trying to get their work from their studio wall to the collector wall. So that's one way to think about it. Let's look at another way, which is the market center viewpoint. So again, we're switching viewpoints, right? So if you walk with me, we're going to switch the way we're looking at things. So the other one was artist centered. If you're an artist, what are some of the things that you're thinking about? This is market centered. I actually had a $ put here in the middle instead of the word market centered, but I thought it was a little bit too much on the nose. But if you're thinking about like, who are the people that are thinking about money? If you're just thinking about money, not like the artist putting out work into the world and they need to interact with people. This is, you're thinking about money, who are, what's that viewpoint? So the micro view here. So we're looking at the micro view with a market-centered kind of approach. The micro view in this example, these are the types of things that I see and have seen more of over the past year, definitely over the past 5 years. But these are the things that I'm seeing on the ground with my own clients. So you have more direct to collector sales distribution. So I'm using art terms, but I'm switching into heavy business language, right? So it's not like, oh, my art is like getting to a collector. I want to get my art in the hands of a collector. The way to think about it, I suggest from a business perspective, is it's a distribution channel. So what I'm seeing is more artists who are focused on developing the direct to collector distribution channel. Another way to say that is Instagram, right? Putting things on Instagram, collectors reaching out to you directly, and then you're selling work. There's just been I can't even quantify. I mean, it's just like a 300%. I mean, it's like some percentage that this has changed tremendously over the past, particularly 3 or 4 years, and definitely over time, just this idea that artists are using the internet to sell work directly to collector, meaning they're bypassing the gallery, or they're bypassing the dealer or the consultant. There's a trend of brands commissioning artists, a lot of brands at the local level and at the national and international level, reaching out directly to artists and commissioning them for projects. So again, this is very different from the traditional sort of distribution channel where an artist is like working with a gallerist or working with a mentor or something like that, and they're working to get their art in the hands of the collectors through those channels. These are brands saying, hey, artists, I really like your work. Can you do a mural? Can you do this? Can you design whatever? Can you be a part of our campaign? So that's a lot that's happening more often. Artists as influencers, that's a trend that I'm seeing at a micro level where it switches from the artist making the finished product to the interest being in how the artist makes the work, and then what sorts of products is the artist using? Is there a certain drink that the artist is drinking? It's artists as influencers. So my clients are being hired to provide influencer services, not just to produce art, which is the final product. You have artists helping artists. I have a couple clients who they themselves are artists, and they started organizations, for-profit organizations that serve as art agencies. So they're aggregators. So they sit kind of here, and they're going and getting the opportunities, developing contracts with, let's say, like real estate, like commercial real estate developers, for instance. And then they're entering into contracts at that level, and then they're going and bringing these opportunities to artists for commissions, for on-site art exhibitions, things like that. So you have companies who are looking to artists to curate these experiences, right? That's marketing language. And they're looking to artists to do that. Business services for artists, again, there's all sorts of consultants and coaches and all sorts of folks who are providing like coaching services and consulting services to artists. I'm seeing more of that. A huge shift away from the nonprofit mindset to the for-profit mindset. Also, art is an investment when it comes to collectors. For the collectors that I represent, they are very keen on their work because they love it, the work that they collect because they love it, but also it's an investment. So they're asking different types of questions. And the artist as a brand. So the artist is not just the person making the work, the artist is a brand, right? So that is a shift in mindset of individual artists when it comes to market and like specifically making money. At the macro level, these are things that we've all been talking about, right? They can really be summarized into the COVID effects, but we've seen a shift to online sales. And if you were to go and look at, if you were just to go look at art market trends, there's many different ways to look at it. There are the collectors and the reports that the collectors look at. You have the galleries and how they're thinking about trends. You have the artists and how they're thinking about trends. There's many different touch points, all those folks that were on the other slide. They're all looking at the trends of what's happening in the ecosystem from a different perspective. But the consensus is, yeah, there's been a massive shift to online sales. There has been a wealth increase for many collectors because we know that there's a lot of people that made a lot of money during the pandemic, and we're seeing an increase in the collecting from millennials that are in like tech-based kind of jobs and who focus their energies in the tech space. There's an increase in wealth. There's, you know, collectors out there who are purchasing. You have tech-enabled solutions. Again, that's code for blockchain and NFT, but I'm calling it tech-enabled because if you just focus on NFTs and then you don't pay attention to what's happening with blockchain in general and how that's impacting art, you're going to miss out on some things. I know NFTs are the hot thing right now. Everybody's like, oh, great, NFTs, great. And people are making a lot of money, but it's actually bigger than the NFTs. It's blockchain and what blockchain means for the art ecosystem. So if you are an artist that's interested in getting into like the business side of art, looking at what's happening with blockchain is a good place to start, not just NFTs, because there are some other things that are going on. There's a focus on sustainability. So that's both in artist materials and also just, you know, the sustainability of the market. This happened in fashion as well, where people started to look at like where does the cotton come from? Is it organic? You know, things like that. So even with, there's been a shift in like shipping companies, for instance, who are using recycled material. They're rethinking how to ship things, or like aggregating shipments and then like shipping them all at once so they can like reduce the carbon footprint. So sustainability is a trend. There's a hyper local focus. You may have seen this if you're paying attention to what's going on in your own like neck of the woods, depending on where you are. But the idea is that the museums, the local galleries, those types of institutions are becoming and have become over the pandemic more important in terms of like developing artists, and then also like the main touch point for collectors. There's an argument that it's always been like that, but there is something that even the curators are noticing in terms of how museums are interacting with the public, because they see their role to be a little bit different than it was in a pre-pandemic space. You have the collector as consumer. This is a big trend where you start to see like auction houses commission artists to do more what would typically be considered like collectible items, and have these collaborations with the luxury brands and the artists. I mean, there's like a list of these types of collaborations, but the point is that the collector is also a consumer, and they're willing to spend money on things that aren't necessarily like a painting, but more like these sort of collectible items. Yeah, the battle between the gallery and the auction, right? It just like increased over COVID. where you have auctions that are getting into the like primary art sale space, which is typically the world of the gallery. And so you're seeing auction houses kind of move into that. And of course, there's an increased demand for Black art. I mean, there's so many ways to say that, but the point is that for the folks who are looking at art as an investment, this is something that they're really focused on at a macro level in terms of what's happening in the art ecosystem. So again, that was just an overview of the macro view of what's happening in the economy, the creative economy, as a cultural shift, like not the Industrial Revolution, it's the creative economy. This is a massive cultural shift. And then from there, we kind of drill down into what's happening in the art ecosystem. And then we took a look at how that is viewed from the artist perspective. And then we focused on the art market perspective in terms of sort of what's happening. So let's focus now on navigating this art ecosystem. And I am confident we'll have time for questions. I'm going to kind of run through this very quickly, but I want to leave some time for questions. But we're going to shift to, all right, fine. We know this thing, right? What is this thing? It's the arts ecosystem. Okay, but how do you navigate this art ecosystem? So I have three main ways that I suggest you can navigate this sort of art world. And they're all philosophical. They're philosophical, right? They're practical, but they're philosophical. The first thing is that it's important to shift your mindset, again, away from the tortured, starving artist in their studio who's just like waiting on somebody to come by and like purchase something. Yeah, when you shift your mindset maybe from that viewpoint to artist as an art market participant, artist as a participant in the creative economy, then we start to have kind of like this more of a business mind overlay. And really, it's kind of 4 touch points, I think, that you kind of find when you're looking at what you're doing from a sustainability standpoint, when you're trying to support your family as an artist. You know, you always will be creating, generating ideas, figuring out, you know, what direction to go in. From there, you're in the build or scaling kind of stage. Scaling is kind of like the way the startups talk about it. You're scaling your ideas, you're establishing foundations, you're investing in infrastructure, which may be like a legal structure. Then you go to protection. That's when you're taking a look at what you have, what you've established, and now you're looking at risk. You're looking at where are the sort of areas within your practice that are exposed, where, you know, someone can take advantage of you. So you're thinking about protection. You're also thinking about protecting your intellectual property. And then from there, you're kind of like on a growth trajectory. Once you kind of tackle those things, or you get comfortable with that creation to build, to protect kind of wavelength, sort of at the end of it, you start to think about growth in a different way, where you're anticipating issues, you're pursuing sustainability. The case studies that I'll take you through pretty much walk through this mindset, where you just go from making the work to building a foundation to support your work. Now you're trying to protect your work. You've become protective of it because now you realize there's value to it. And then from there, you're just growing your art practice. You're either expanding the work that you do. I have an artist that I work with who literally started expanding the size of their work. So they grew literally in terms of size. And once they went to a larger scale works, the risk shifted, right? Because there's a difference between a work that you can put in a box and ship versus a work that's going to be shipped internationally that's like the size of a car. So things shift, right? So this is a constant thing, right? So this ebb and flow of shifting between just making work to thinking about, and you can apply the macro view here, thinking about how things expand in your own practice. This is something, if you're comfortable with the shift in mindset over time, you're better able to take advantage of what's happening in the ecosystem. You know, second thing is you want to understand structure. Art history is important, says the art history major, right? No, but it's really important to understand art history. Listen, you don't need a degree, just there are a bunch of books that you can read, particularly if you're interested in what's happening currently with Black art. It would behoove you to read a number of publications about Black art, right? To get an understanding of not just what's sort of hot now, but what that means in terms of the trends of how Black art has been collected over time. So art history is still important. legal framework is important. So once you get a grasp of like the timeline, like where are you in the canon of art history? Where is your own personal work really in the canon of art history, right? Once you have that viewpoint, then let's start looking at the legal framework. That may sound self-serving, but this is a part of the foundation. Business law, intellectual property, trust in the states, understanding the difference between the rights that you have in an artist at a federal level versus the rights that you have in an artist at the state level. This was the topic of my last presentation. So if you weren't able to join us for that, I implore you to go back and take a look at that discussion, but it's talking about artist rights. There's protections for you at the federal level in the United States as well as the state. And then there's a difference between legislation like statutes and what's on the books. We call that the black letter law versus contracts, which are ways to manage your relationships. Understanding the art market, just keeping tabs on the things that we talked about, like what's happening at a macro level. And then also motivation. I put an asterisk here because anyone that you're interacting with in the art ecosystem, you want to know their motivations. It's a part of understanding the ecosystem and being able to navigate it. Some things might sound self-explanatory, right? The gallerist wants to sell your work. Yeah, but drill down. What is that gallerist trying to do in terms of orienting itself versus other galleries? Where does that gallery sit amongst the local galleries in reputation? Where does that gallery sit in terms of where they're trying to move in the art market, right? Maybe they're trying to turn into a blue chip gallery. There's all sorts of information that you can get when you pay attention to the motivations of the folks that you're working with. And then you have, well, the point there is just to educate yourself. And then you have strategy, and I'll just kind of go through this. These are the three main things. You want to look at things from the blue sky standpoint. I'll describe to you what that means in a minute. I call it divide and conquer. I'm a lawyer. I'm used to that confrontational language. You might want to say something else. You might want to think about it differently. But strategy is about dividing and conquer. Like, what are you focused on, and what do you want, and how do you get it? What are you focused on? How do you segment it? So it's developing a divide and conquer strategy, and it's extreme honesty. And we'll see that in the case study. Honesty about what you want to do as an artist, honesty about who you want to work with, how you want to work, honesty about where you want your work to end up. You might want your work in the hands of certain types of collectors. Just be honest. And once you think about it that way, that can help you navigate the art ecosystem to get to where you want to be. So let's see, looking at the time here. Yeah, I think we're doing pretty good. So this is a case study of an artist that I represent. So I'm taking you through how we work together to get the artists from where they were when we first started working to kind of where they are now, which is that this particular artist hit their own financial goal for what they wanted to sell by a factor of 4, meaning they quadrupled what they were making and they did this during a pandemic based on and this is during the time that we've worked together based on strategy. And it's been my distinct pleasure to work with this artist to kind of help them think about what they're doing in terms of navigating the space. But what I'm gonna walk you through is it's the difference between interacting with a legal professional as an attorney versus as a counselor. When you seek counsel, you're thinking more of strategy, you're thinking way long-term. When you are working with an attorney, you're typically what you're focused on is maybe short-term. When people are looking for lawyers, it's typically because something's gone haywire. So think about that. Someone's infringing on your work. Oh, you need a lawyer. That's typically what you'll say. So the role of professionals in your art practice shifts depending on kind of where you are. But this particular artist is a maker artist focused on the fine art world. So this is someone who is not interested in like commercial art and licensing, murals and working with commercial entities. This is a person that is focused on collectors, residencies, museums, institutions, publications. They're focused on the fine art world. So kind of the first thing we did, and I'm going to kind of speed through this. First thing we did was we set a strategic blue sky goal for the artwork and the artist's life's work. Blue sky means without any restrictions. If you think about a world where there aren't any resource constraints, you're not having to deal with patriarchy or colonialism, whatever. There's no constraints, right? What does your world look like as an artist? What do you want? what do you want for your artwork? Like, where do you want it? And then what do you want for your life's work? Like, what is it that you want to see? If you're standing at the end of your life looking backwards, what do you want to see? So we started there. So we set that plan. Then what we did, and these are some suggestions on kind of like, and I hope you're thinking about your own artistic practice as we go through this. Then we took an inventory of their artwork and the relationships. So we went and we took an inventory of every single bit of artwork that they currently had. Where was it, right? And then what were the various relationships? And what we found with this artist is that they were very scattered in terms of the galleries they were working with, where their art was, and there wasn't any sort of rhyme or reason to it. It was just more based on over the course of their career. They started working with someone, then they just kept giving them work. They sold some, maybe didn't sell other work, right? And then they just kept entering into these relationships. And so, of course, you know what's coming next is we analyze that situation and we looked at, okay, where are we now currently with these relationships and where your work is and where you want it to go versus like the future. So one goal that this artist had was that their work end up in collections of major collectors. That was a definition that this artist had. And so we then had to look at the relationships and the galleries that they were working with to figure out whether or not those galleries were best suited to get the artist's work where they wanted it to be. This is hyper focused on goals. We identified the people and places, right? That slide that we saw before. We identified the people and places where we needed to fill gaps. This artist, we identified that this artist did very well in the direct-to-collector market for certain types of collectors that they were interested in. And so one gap that needed to be filled was more assistance on the social media side, right? Because that's a direct-to-collector distribution channel. We set an intention for this artist's work, you know, how they work, their artwork, and where they want their work to be. Again, this artist had a expressed desire to make sure that their work was collected by certain groups of people, AKA Black folks. And we evaluated every opportunity and we negotiated every contract based on the blue sky goals. Another way of saying that is, if there was something that came across this artist's desk that did not fit in one of the things that we'd already talked about and established, we just said no. And and this was like one of the first times this artist was able to say no, right, financially. But there are certain galleries that reached out to them. We did due diligence, figured out where they may fit. The answer was no. People coming in from all sorts of places interested in this particular artist, there are things that we just said no to because they didn't fit, right, with the plan. And there was some shift in relationships. There were some gallerists where they had inventory for a long time. They had moved the inventory. Okay, so now we have to rethink how that's going to work. So there's shift in relationships. We established some new relationships based on their goals. We set boundaries on time and workload, meaning just because a group of people, in this case, a gallery, was saying, I need more work, it doesn't necessarily mean that the artist was going to, and to use the artist's words, enslave themselves to those entities for work. So we set boundaries. We're doing this amount of work per year. That's the inventory. We're not doing more than that. So that's the sort of mindset shift and even like the workload of this particular artist. And developing an estate plan, which includes the management of intellectual property. Very important because a physical piece of artwork is separate than the copyright in the artwork. Your copyright lasts for your life on earth plus 70 years after you pass away. So just because someone has purchased a piece of artwork, that doesn't mean that your stewardship over the intellectual property ends. There's still a copyright, it's still alive, and it will be alive 70 years after you physically leave this earth. This is very important from a wealth creation and a estate planning standpoint. And this artist has certain work in their inventory that they want to keep for themselves and their family. So we identified that and we're pursuing an estate plan. Mid-career artists, again, I'm gonna leave some time here. I think I'm right at 5 but I'll just kind of blow through this. This is a mid-career artist, but this artist is focused on commercial art. So they're interested in licensing. They're interested in working with brands. They're interested in those types of things, not necessarily fine art in museums with collectors. Their focus is commercial art. So it was more of a business kind of conversation, right? So we're talking about current business plan. We looked at their legal structure. They had an LLC. That was great. We took an inventory of their artwork, but we're looking at their past deals. What kind of licensing deals have they done? What kind of deals have they done? Like, what have you done in the past? That's what we looked at. We set a plan for protecting their IP. So both the copyrights and registering those, because you need to protect the copyright if you're going to license it. And then this particular artist was developing the artist as brand type of strategy. So we're protecting the trademark associated with the artist. They have their own logo, for instance. We looked at their markets for their artwork. We also identified people and places. Same thing, right? Similar mindset. We segmented legal services based on their negotiation needs, right? So for at the beginning when I was working with this artist, deals under a certain dollar amount, I didn't touch them. They dealt with that. Deals over a certain dollar amount, the contract value, those are the things I negotiated. We manage their internal relationship with contracts, right? So this is the type of artist that has studio assistants and photographers and all kinds of people that they work with. So we got contractor agreements in place for those individuals. We declined opportunities that weren't a good fit. Same thing, saying no, it didn't fit in the business plan. We based the negotiation of deals on license duration, right? So it's like, if they have licensed their artwork for this particular product category, when they're working with this other brand, they have to make sure that there's no overlap. And so so what we did, and the way we do this, we manage this with an Excel file, and we're actually tracking which deals they have, what are the product categories, what are they blocked out from doing, and how long. So it's very strategic in terms of this commercial artist. And of course, this estate plan is still there. Here's the emerging artist. At first, I had here doing everything, but at first I had doing the most. So when I'm working with emerging artists, and emerging means artists who's just now selling their work, and so they're very excited about everything, and that tends to get you in trouble because you're not thinking about things strategically. With emerging artists that I work with, I typically come in on the crisis management side, right? They're looking for a lawyer. And so I'm in to help just, resolve disputes, deal with the pain that they're in right then with some sort of contract issue or lack of contract issues, most of it. And then typically with emerging artists, they don't come back to me until there's more crisis management, something blows up again. Typically, you only will have to walk through that 2 times before you start to shift a little bit, where you decide that the cost of dealing with things that way is like more than just kind of thinking about it strategically from the beginning. But with the emerging artists, we develop a process to better scrutinize opportunities, right? Lawyers call that due diligence, but there's a way that you as an artist can learn how to evaluate an opportunity. So, and that brings down the cost, right, of working with a professional, because if you on the front end can weed out, I'll call it nonsense, if you can weed out the nonsense on the front end before you bring it to someone like an attorney to review it, that cuts down on the cost, right? Because you develop this like ability to scrutinize opportunities. With emerging artist clients, and this is kind of a bunch of emerging artist clients put together, I typically review contracts for the largest opportunities, the ones with the largest risk, the ones with the biggest folks on the other side, the ones who have the most power, the ones who have the most money to hire like a floor of lawyers to kind of go against the artists. I typically will work on those types of deals for emerging artists. I help them understand their intellectual property, like what I just said about copyright. I help them look at short-term versus long-term goals. We take an inventory of their projects. Typically, emerging artists are doing all kinds of stuff. They're taking images and putting them on t-shirts and they're selling them. They're like doing commissions, they're doing murals, they're trying to get into fine art. Like they're doing all kinds of stuff, doing the most. And so we just take an inventory of the project, and then we take a look at, all right, what are you doing just to pay bills versus what do you think will be sort of sustainable over time? And each artist answers that question the way that they can, right? You be honest about that. Same thing, we identify people and places and needed to fill any sort of gaps. And then we develop a plan to establish structure, which is usually getting some sort of legal structure. So in conclusion, the best way to advocate for yourself as you're navigating the art ecosystem is to seek counsel, right? And I'm saying that in terms of this idea that you don't have to perish for lack of counsel. Counsel here is not just legal counsel. Counsel is other artists. Counsel includes mentors, it includes consultants, it includes the people in the art ecosystem. There are a number of times when someone will come to me with a problem that is astronomical, and then when you drill down to it, it comes back to that particular person not taking time to get counsel even from the artists who are doing the same thing. or not getting counsel from artists who may be further along in their path than where this particular artist is, or artists for whatever reason feeling that they can't reach out to other artists to ask them questions. Whenever we're looking at gallery relationships, I'll just tell you, if we're doing a due diligence on a gallery, we take a look at that gallery's reputation and how they treat artists. So if I go and find if I go do a litigation analysis and find that the gallery has been caught up in litigation because they didn't pay something or something else happened, that's important, right? That's legal counsel. But my point is that when you're navigating the art ecosystem, like understanding who you're working with, like getting references, asking those types of questions, seeking counsel can really help avoid a lot of difficulties. I can run a list of like horror stories of things that I've dealt with. We don't have time for that, but it is important, right? Don't perish for lack of counsel, because there's plenty of folks within that ecosystem that you can reach out to even just get some information. Googling things, step one, try to find someone that's within your space that you can talk to about issues. So that's the end of my talk today. Again, a lot of information. I hope we have at least a couple minutes for questions, but thank you again for your time and for listening. Like I said, nothing was legal advice. If you want to get in contact with me, here is my information, pretty easy to find. It's just info@goodsonlaw.com. So thank you guys.
All right, thank you so much. This was amazing, and I learned so much even just from my perspective, being a collector myself and, of course, running BlkArthouse. So there was one question in the chat from Phil that I thought is pretty good, and I'll let him pose his work.
Cool.
Oh, was I supposed to ask? My bad. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, go for it.
But yeah, first the presentation was great. Like that, so much was learned. But have you worked with artists interested in working in fine art and commercial art? Because my main medium is photography, and I feel like that medium can work well in both areas.
Yeah, and that's a great question. Most artists straddle. Even that commercial artists, they do have a fine art practice. That's not their focus. But yeah, a lot of artists straddle. If you're going to straddle, the segmentation and kind of thinking about the different viewpoints becomes more important. Main reason is because you don't want to do anything on the commercial side that's going to negatively impact the fine art side. So photographers are like the easiest way to think about it. Like if you're licensing certain images for whatever, like for stock photography, that's a good example. If it's something that you think is going to sell from a fine art photography space, don't license it for stock photography. And that seems like duh, that makes sense. But it's very easy to get the two mixed up where you're crossing between fine art and commercial art, and you can cause problems later on. So if you're trying to do a limited edition of something you think is really great on the fine art side, but you license it to a stock photography company, then you're like, basically encroaching, you're cannibalizing your own market. So yeah, that's a great question. But yeah, it's just segmenting, just figuring out what you want to accomplish in both spaces, and then really being clear about what you're doing in both of those areas. There are some people that are of the opinion that the difference between fine art and commercial art isn't like it's blurred. And I could understand that argument, but from a strategy standpoint, to me, it's just helpful to keep them kind of separate, have things in separate buckets. Yeah. And murals tend to be commercial art. And so I've have clients who sit who are muralists in the commercial space. They do a lot of commissions, but then they have their fine art practice, and the commercial practice supports the fine art practice as they're developing it. So it's actually pretty cool how we've been able to kind of focus on both with an understanding that one kind of feeds the other. Yeah. Great question. Thanks for the question.
Thank you for the answer.
Absolutely.
I was going to also ask, do you represent Avita?
Avita, yeah, so this artist, well, Avita, you recognize this artist. This is the work of Avita Tizano. In terms of who I represent, unless the artist reveals it, I don't really say who I represent.
Oh, I'm sorry, my bad.
yeah, no problems. Some people do, some lawyers do, they have it like all over their websites. I don't, just because there are times when I'm negotiating contracts, but the other party doesn't. I'm like I'm working with the artist to negotiate with the other side. And that's helpful for many reasons. So I don't publicize who I'm working with, especially if I'm working with an artist who's trying to develop a certain posture. It's kind of tell you what to say and how to negotiate, and then which is very empowering. And then we kind of move on from there. But yeah, I don't reveal who I represent. But I'm glad you recognize this artist. It's Avita Tizano.
Yeah, y'all follow her. Her work is so dope. But yeah, cool.
Yeah, she's amazing. All right, I was looking in the chat. Any other?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Actually, can you give me 1 second? Actually, Sammetria, I need to jump off, but
Okay.
I can make you host, so everybody should be able to stay on and ask as many questions as you want. So
Okay, awesome.
Thank you all for being here. Let me know if you have any more questions. Bye all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.